My parents said I wasn't welcome at my sister's wedding, but when I decided to vanish, they were shocked. My name is Amy, and I've spent my entire 28 years living in the shadow of my older sister. I need to tell you this story because maybe you'll understand what I couldn't see for so long, that some families are built on foundations that crumble the moment you stop holding them up. Growing up in our small house on Maple Street, I learned early that love came with conditions. When I brought home a B+ on my math test, my parents would nod absently and ask where my sister was. When she walked through the door an hour later with an A, suddenly the kitchen filled with celebration. "Look how well she's doing," my mother would beam, hanging the test on the refrigerator while mine sat forgotten on the counter. I was 7 when I first tried to change this pattern. I spent weeks preparing for the school talent show, practicing piano until my fingers ached. The night of the performance, I played flawlessly, a complex piece that had taken me months to master. Backstage afterward, I waited for my parents with a heart full of hope. My father appeared first, his face distracted. "That was nice, sweetie. Your sister just called. She made the honor roll again. We need to go celebrate." That's when I learned that being good wasn't enough. Being great wasn't enough. There would always be something more important happening in her life. 3 states away at college, pursuing the kind of success that seemed to matter more than anything I could achieve right here at home. The pattern repeated itself endlessly. When I graduated high school as salutatorian, they attended but spent the entire ceremony talking about her graduate school applications. When I got my first job at the local marketing firm, their response was lukewarm compared to their excitement about her internship at a prestigious company in New York. I told myself it was because she was the firstborn, the trailblazer. I told myself they were proud of me too, just in a quieter way. I told myself a lot of things that weren't true because the alternative, accepting that I was fundamentally less important to them, felt impossible to live with. By my mid-20s, I had unconsciously molded myself into the family's invisible support system. I was the one who remembered birthdays, who organized family gatherings, who stayed close to home while she built her impressive life elsewhere. I was dependable, reliable, forgettable Amy, always there when needed, never missed when absent. The worst part wasn't the neglect itself. It was how natural it felt, how completely I had accepted this role. I didn't even realize I was angry until much later, when everything finally collapsed. For now, I just kept trying harder, believing that eventually my devotion would be rewarded with the love and recognition I craved. I was wrong about so many things back then, but I'm getting ahead of myself. First, you need to understand how deeply I believed in this family, how desperately I wanted to belong to something that had never really wanted me back. By 18, I had mastered the art of being grateful for crumbs. While my sister headed off to an elite university with great fanfare and family financing, I enrolled at the local community college. Not because I couldn't get into better schools, my grades were solid, but because someone needed to stay close to home. Someone needed to be available. "It's so practical of you," my mother said when I announced my decision. Not proud, not excited, practical. The word felt like a consolation prize wrapped in false praise. My sister called home once a week, usually on Sunday evenings, and the entire household would revolve around that 30-minute conversation. My parents would gather around the speakerphone in the kitchen, hanging on every word about her classes, her professors, her social life. I learned to make myself scarce during these calls, but I could still hear the warmth in their voices, a tone they never quite used with me. During my sophomore year, I started working part-time at a local nonprofit while maintaining a perfect GPA. I thought surely this combination of academic success and community service would earn me some recognition. Instead, my parents were too busy planning their first visit to see her college to notice my achievements. "She's doing so well," my father would tell anyone who would listen. Full scholarship, internships lined up, the whole package. When people politely asked about me, he'd say, "Oh, Amy's doing fine too. She's very steady, reliable, practical." These became the words that defined me in family conversations, as if being consistent was somehow less valuable than being extraordinary. After community college, I transferred to the state university 30 minutes away, close enough to come home for Sunday dinners, close enough to handle any family emergencies. My sister was launching her career in New York by then, landing at a consulting firm that paid her more in her first year than my father made in 2. I found myself constantly making excuses for staying local. "I love this area," I'd say. "Not everyone needs to live in a big city to be happy." But the truth was, I was terrified of leaving. What if something happened and they needed me? What if, in my absence, I became even more invisible than I already felt? The comparisons never stopped. At family gatherings, relatives would ask about both of us, but the conversation always shifted quickly to her accomplishments. "And what about you, Amy?" they'd ask as an afterthought. "Still working at that little office downtown?" That little office downtown became my refuge. I threw myself into work, earning promotions and taking on responsibilities beyond my job description. My boss appreciated my dedication, my coworkers relied on my follow-through, and clients requested me specifically. For 40 hours a week, I existed in a space where my contributions mattered, but evenings and weekends pulled me back into my family role. I became the default organizer of holiday celebrations, the one who remembered to send cards, the one who checked on our aging grandparents. These tasks felt important, necessary, but they were never acknowledged as contributions. They were simply expected from steady, reliable, practical Amy. When I turned 25, I made a resolution to become more assertive, to speak up about my achievements and demand equal attention. It lasted exactly 3 weeks, until my sister called to announce her engagement to someone she'd been dating for 6 months. The celebration that followed made my birthday party look like a quiet Tuesday dinner. Looking back, I can see how I participated in my own diminishment. I accepted the supporting role so completely that challenging it felt selfish, almost aggressive. Everything changed when my mother fainted at the grocery store. I was 26 then, comfortable in my routine of work, family obligations, and the quiet hope that someday things would be different. The call came while I was finishing a presentation for a major client. My father's voice was shaky, uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. "The doctor wants to run some tests," he said. "Can you meet us at the hospital?" I dropped everything and drove there immediately, my mind racing through possibilities. When I arrived, I found my father pacing the waiting room, his usual confidence replaced by anxiety that made him look older than his 62 years. The test revealed early-stage diabetes and high blood pressure, manageable conditions, but ones that required significant lifestyle changes. My mother, who had always been the family's emotional center despite her favoritism, suddenly seemed fragile and overwhelmed by the new reality of medication schedules and dietary restrictions. "We should call your sister," she said from her hospital bed. "She'll know what questions to ask the doctors." I had been there for 6 hours, taking notes, researching treatment options on my phone, and coordinating with her physicians. But of course, we needed to call the daughter who lived 800 miles away and hadn't been home in 4 months. The phone consultation lasted an hour. My sister, equipped with her business school training and commanding presence, peppered the doctors with questions I had already asked. She demanded second opinions, researched specialists, and created action plans with the efficiency of someone managing a corporate project. My parents were visibly relieved to have her taking charge, even from a distance. "Thank goodness we have someone who knows how to handle these situations," my father said after the call ended. I sat in the corner, holding the folder of information I had compiled, feeling like a secretary whose boss had just arrived to take over. From that point forward, I became the family's informal caregiver. I drove my mother to appointments, picked up prescriptions, and learned to cook the low-sodium, diabetic-friendly meals her condition required. I researched insurance coverage, found specialists within our network, and created a medication tracking system. My sister called twice a week to check in and offer advice from afar. During these calls, my parents would update her on test results and treatment progress, as if I hadn't been the one managing every aspect of the situation. She would make suggestions for adjustments to the care plan, most of which I had already researched and discussed with the doctors. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was doing the work, but she was getting the credit for being the responsible, caring daughter who stayed involved despite her busy career and geographic distance. My own career began to suffer as I took time off for medical appointments and family emergencies. I turned down a promotion that would have required occasional travel, knowing that my parents needed someone nearby they could depend on. When my boss asked about it, I made the usual excuses about preferring stability and work-life balance. Meanwhile, my sister's career continued to flourish. She received another promotion and moved to an even more expensive apartment in Manhattan. During her brief holiday visits, she would breeze in with expensive gifts and dramatic stories about her high-powered job, captivating my parents with her energy and success. I watched from the kitchen, usually preparing meals or cleaning up, as they hung on every word about her life. The contrast was stark. She was living an exciting, important life, worthy of attention and admiration, while I was simply maintaining the daily operations that kept our family functioning. The sacrifice felt noble at the time. I told myself I was being mature, responsible, putting family before personal ambition. But slowly, resentment began to build in places I didn't want to acknowledge. Not toward my mother's illness, That wasn't anyone's fault, but toward the assumption that my time, my career, my life were naturally less important than hers. The call came on a rainy Tuesday in March. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone buzzed with her number, unusual since she typically called on weekends. Her voice was breathless with excitement, barely containing the news she was bursting to share. "I'm getting married," she announced before I could even say hello properly. "He proposed last night at this amazing restaurant overlooking Central Park. The ring is absolutely stunning. 2 carats, princess cut, absolutely perfect." I felt that familiar mix of genuine happiness for her success and the hollow ache of being once again relegated to an audience for her triumphs. "Congratulations," I managed, and meant it. She deserved happiness, even if watching her receive it reminded me of everything I lacked. "I'm calling Mom and Dad next, but I wanted to tell you first," she said, which was probably a lie but a kind one. "We're thinking a fall wedding, maybe October, something elegant but not too big." As she talked about venues and guest lists and the million decisions that come with planning a wedding, something shifted inside me. Here was an opportunity. Maybe the opportunity I'd been waiting for my entire adult life. A chance to prove my worth, to show my family that I could be more than just steady, reliable, practical Amy. "I'd love to help with the planning," I heard myself saying. "I have experience coordinating events through work, and since you're so busy with your career..." "Really? That would be amazing." Her relief was audible. "I was wondering how I was going to manage everything with my work schedule. You're so good at organizing things." Finally, recognition of a skill I possessed. Not just availability or reliability, but actual competence. I felt a surge of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. The next few hours were a whirlwind of phone calls as the news spread through the family. My parents were ecstatic, already talking about guest lists and catering options. When my mother mentioned the complexity of planning a wedding from a distance, I volunteered again to handle the local coordination. "Amy's offered to help with the planning," my father announced, and for once I heard approval in his voice. She's always been good at managing projects. That night I lay awake creating mental lists of everything that would need to be done. Venue research, vendor meetings, budget planning, timeline coordination, all tasks that played to my strengths. For the first time in years, I felt like I had something valuable to contribute to my family, beyond just being available. I threw myself into wedding research with an intensity that surprised even me. I created spreadsheets comparing venues, compiled lists of photographers and florists, and researched everything from invitation designers to transportation services. This wasn't just event planning. This was my chance to finally step out of the shadows and show my family what I was capable of. My sister seemed genuinely grateful for my involvement, calling regularly to discuss options and get my recommendations. My parents, too, began turning to me for updates and advice about wedding-related decisions. After years of feeling invisible, suddenly I was essential. I took vacation days to tour venues, met with caterers on weekends, and spent evenings researching vendors and creating comparison charts. My own social life, already limited, virtually disappeared as I channeled all my energy into making her wedding perfect. Looking back, I can see how desperate I was for this validation, how much I needed to believe that my contributions mattered. I invested not just time and effort, but hope. The hope that finally doing something significant for the family would earn me the place I'd always wanted. I was about to learn that good intentions and hard work aren't always enough to change established patterns. But for those first few weeks, planning her wedding felt like the most important thing I'd ever done. The next 6 months consumed my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. What started as enthusiastic volunteering became an all-encompassing obsession with creating the perfect wedding. I transformed my spare bedroom into a command center, with vendor contacts, timelines, and budget spreadsheets covering every available surface. My sister had strong opinions about every detail, which she shared during our increasingly frequent phone calls. The venue I'd spent weeks researching wasn't quite right. Too traditional. The photographer whose portfolio I'd carefully reviewed didn't match her vision. Too posed. The florist I'd met with 3 times needed to completely redesign the centerpieces. Too predictable. "I trust your judgment," she'd say after rejecting another option. "But I just know what I want, you know?" I did know. I knew because I was the one meeting with vendors, explaining her vision, and attempting to translate her long-distance preferences into reality. Each revision meant additional meetings, rescheduled appointments, and vendors who grew increasingly frustrated with the constant changes. My parents, while appreciative of my efforts, seemed to view my work as a natural extension of my caretaker role, rather than the significant contribution I'd hoped it would be. When relatives called to ask about wedding plans, they'd say, Amy's handling all the details, in the same tone they might use to mention that I was handling the grocery shopping. The financial aspect became particularly stressful. While my sister and her fiancé were paying for the major expenses, I found myself covering smaller costs that added up quickly. Parking fees for vendor meetings, gas for venue visits, rushed alterations to samples that needed to be shipped overnight. My credit card balance grew steadily, but I told myself it was an investment in family harmony. The criticism became more frequent as the wedding date approached. The invitation wording I'd coordinated wasn't quite what she'd envisioned. The menu tasting I'd arranged included options that didn't reflect her dietary preferences correctly. The timeline I developed with the venue coordinator was too rushed in some areas, too slow in others. "I know you're doing your best," my mother said after a particularly tense family call, "but your sister has very specific standards. This day needs to be perfect for her." Perfect. The word that had haunted my entire relationship with my family. She deserved perfect because she was the successful one, the important one, the one whose happiness mattered most. My job was to deliver perfect, not to be appreciated for the effort required to achieve it. I began working evenings and weekends exclusively on wedding tasks. My own friends stopped inviting me to social gatherings because I was always busy with vendor meetings or family obligations. My boss expressed concern about my increasing distraction during work hours, as wedding-related calls and emails interrupted my professional responsibilities. 3 weeks before the wedding, disaster struck. The original cake designer had to cancel due to a family emergency, leaving us scrambling to find a replacement. I spent 2 days calling every bakery within 50 miles, finally finding someone who could accommodate the order on short notice, for double the original price. When I called to update everyone on the situation, my sister's response was immediate and harsh. "How could you let this happen? Didn't you have a backup plan?" My father's disappointment was evident in his voice. "Amy, we trusted you to handle these details. This kind of last-minute crisis shouldn't happen with proper planning." I had been managing hundreds of details for months, coordinating with dozens of vendors, and adapting to constant changes in requirements. One vendor cancellation due to circumstances beyond anyone's control, and suddenly I was the one who had failed to plan properly. That night, I sat surrounded by wedding binders and vendor contracts, feeling more alone than I had in years. I was giving everything I had to make this event perfect, and somehow I still wasn't doing enough. The morning before the wedding, I woke up at 5 a.m. with a checklist that covered 3 pages. Final vendor confirmations, last-minute pickup runs, and coordination meetings filled every hour until the rehearsal dinner. I had been planning this day for weeks, but the magnitude of everything that needed to happen in the next 36 hours felt overwhelming. The ceremony was scheduled for Saturday afternoon at the historic Gardens venue, with a reception immediately following. I had confirmed and reconfirmed every detail, created backup plans for the backup plans, and packed an emergency kit that could handle anything from missing boutonnieres to torn dresses. By noon Friday, I was running ahead of schedule. The flowers had been delivered and approved, the caterers were setting up according to plan, and even the replacement cake had arrived looking exactly as requested. For the first time in months, I felt like everything might actually go smoothly. That's when I made the mistake that would change everything. I had picked up the final box of decorative elements from the rental company, specialty linens, custom lighting, and handmade centerpiece components that my sister had insisted were essential to her vision. The box was heavier than expected, and I was juggling it along with my purse, phone, and the ever-present wedding binder as I headed to my car. My phone rang just as I was loading everything into the trunk. It was the venue coordinator with a question about the timeline for the reception. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it was 5 minutes of distraction while I stood next to my open car, discussing logistics and making notes. After hanging up, I drove straight to the venue to handle the final setup details. I spent the next 4 hours working with vendors, adjusting decorations, and ensuring every element was positioned correctly. By 6 p.m., the rehearsal was starting, and I rushed home to change clothes for the dinner. It wasn't until I was getting dressed that I realized what I had done. The box of decorative elements was still sitting in my trunk, forgotten during that phone call hours earlier. The specialty linens that were supposed to complement the centerpieces, the custom lighting that would create the ambiance my sister had specifically requested, the handmade details that had cost a fortune and taken weeks to create, all of it was in my car instead of at the venue. I called the venue coordinator immediately, but she had already left for the evening. The rehearsal dinner was starting in an hour, and tomorrow's setup crew wouldn't arrive until morning. There was no way to incorporate the decorative elements into the existing setup without completely redoing the entire room arrangement. I sat on my bed, staring at the phone, trying to figure out how to explain this to my family. One moment of distraction, one oversight in months of meticulous planning, and I had potentially ruined the visual centerpiece of my sister's wedding reception. The rehearsal dinner was torture. Every time someone mentioned how beautiful everything looked, how perfectly organized the wedding was going to be, I felt the weight of my mistake growing heavier. I kept looking for the right moment to confess what had happened, but the evening was full of toasts and celebration, and I couldn't bring myself to introduce bad news into the joy. I told myself I could fix it in the morning. Maybe the setup crew could incorporate the elements somehow. Maybe the room would look fine without them. Maybe no one would notice the missing details that had seemed so crucial during the planning process. But I knew better. My sister would notice. She noticed everything, especially when it came to the vision she had spent months refining. And when she noticed, everyone would know who was responsible. That night, I barely slept. I kept replaying that moment by the car, wishing I had been more careful, more focused. After months of trying to prove my competence, I had failed at the most basic level, simply remembering to deliver everything that was needed. The irony was crushing. In my effort to be perfect, to finally earn recognition and appreciation, I had made exactly the kind of mistake that would confirm every doubt my family had ever had about my capabilities. Morning would bring the reckoning I was dreading. But for now, I lay awake knowing that tomorrow's wedding would be beautiful in every way except the ones that mattered most to the people I was trying so desperately to impress. I arrived at the venue at 7 a.m., hoping to somehow salvage the situation before anyone else noticed. The decorative box sat in my passenger seat like evidence of my incompetence, and I had spent the sleepless night creating increasingly desperate plans to incorporate the elements into the existing setup. The venue coordinator met me with a strained smile. She had clearly been briefed on the situation by the early setup crew. "We can try to work some of these pieces in," she said diplomatically, "but it will mean adjusting the entire room layout. The tables are already set, the lighting is programmed, and the floral arrangements are positioned." "How long would it take?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would be problematic. 3 hours minimum, and we'd need to charge for the additional setup time and overtime for the crew. 3 hours that we didn't have, and additional costs that would come out of my already strained budget. I stood in the beautifully decorated reception space, surrounded by months of careful planning, and felt everything crumbling around that one missing box. My sister arrived an hour later for the final walkthrough, radiant in her confidence that everything would be perfect. She moved through the ceremony space with approval, complimenting the floral arrangements and the seating layout. I followed behind, carrying the weight of my confession. When we reached the reception area, her face immediately shifted. "Where are the specialty linens?" she asked, scanning the tables. "And the custom lighting elements?" I took a breath and explained what had happened. Her expression grew colder with each word, transforming from confusion to disbelief to fury. "You forgot them? After all the time we spent planning these details, you just forgot them?" My parents, who had been admiring the ceremony setup, hurried over when they heard the tension in her voice. Within minutes, I was explaining the situation again to 3 increasingly angry faces. "This is exactly the kind of thing we were worried about," my father said, his disappointment cutting deeper than his anger. "We trusted you with the most important day of your sister's life, and you couldn't handle the basic responsibility of delivering what was needed." My mother's response was quieter but somehow worse. She worked so hard for everything, and now her wedding reception won't look the way she planned because you couldn't keep track of one box. "It was an accident," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "One phone call, 5 minutes of distraction after months of perfect execution. I can pay for the additional setup time. We can still fix this." "Fix this?" My sister's voice was ice. "The photographer comes in 2 hours. The guests start arriving in 4. You think throwing money at this makes up for ruining my vision?" The argument that followed was years of accumulated resentment finally erupting. Every perceived failure, every moment of falling short of expectations, every comparison to my sister's achievements, all of it poured out in that decorated reception hall while vendors pretended not to listen. "You've always been careless," my mother said. "We should have known better than to trust you with something this important." "Maybe," my father added with devastating quiet, "the best wedding gift you could give your sister would be to just not be here. To let her have this day without worrying about what else might go wrong." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Not, "We're disappointed," not, "You made a mistake," but "Don't be here. Don't exist in this family moment. Don't contaminate this important day with your presence." My sister didn't disagree. She stood there, still in her casual clothes, but somehow already transformed into the bride who deserved better than a sister like me, and said nothing to defend me. "Maybe you're right," I heard myself saying. The calmness in my own voice surprised me. Maybe that would be best. I walked out of that venue with my head high and my heart completely broken, leaving behind months of work and years of desperate hope for acceptance. As I drove home, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. If they wanted me gone, I would give them exactly what they asked for. I spent the day of my sister's wedding in my apartment, watching the live stream that one of my cousins had thoughtlessly tagged me in on social media. The venue looked beautiful, of course. Even without the missing decorative elements, the reception was elegant and flawless. My months of planning had created exactly the celebration my sister had envisioned. What struck me wasn't the missing details that had caused such fury that morning. It was how happy everyone looked. My parents beaming with pride, relatives laughing and dancing, my sister radiant in her expensive dress, surrounded by the love and attention she had always commanded so effortlessly. No one looked like they were missing me. No one seemed to notice that the person who had coordinated every aspect of this celebration was conspicuously absent. The family continued to function, to celebrate, to be complete without me. That realization should have been devastating, but instead, it felt clarifying. For 28 years, I had believed I was essential to this family's happiness, that my efforts and sacrifices were keeping us connected. Watching them celebrate so joyfully without me proved what I had never wanted to accept. I was optional, but if I was optional to them, maybe they could be optional to me too. The idea came slowly, building throughout that long day of watching other people celebrate my work while I sat alone in my apartment. What if I took my father's cruel suggestion seriously? What if the best gift I could give this family was my absence? Not just for one day, but permanently. I started researching that very evening, still in my pajamas, still surrounded by wedding planning materials that no longer had any purpose. I looked up housing markets in cities I had never visited, job opportunities in fields I had only dreamed of exploring, legal requirements for changing your life completely. The internet is full of resources for people who want to disappear, I discovered. Not in any dramatic or illegal way, but simply to extract yourself from situations that no longer serve you. There were articles about cutting toxic relationships, forums for people who had successfully relocated and started over, practical guides for protecting your assets when you need to make a clean break. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations. I wasn't planning this to hurt them or to get revenge. I was planning this because I finally understood that I deserved a life where I was valued, appreciated, and loved for who I was rather than what I could provide. The wedding photos appeared on social media over the next few days. Beautiful, professional shots of a perfect celebration. I searched through dozens of images, looking for any sign that my absence had impacted the day. There was nothing. If anything, everyone looked more relaxed, more genuinely happy than I had seen them in family photos for years. My phone had been silent since the morning of the wedding. No apologies, no requests to talk, no acknowledgement that maybe my father's suggestion that I shouldn't exist in their lives had been unnecessarily cruel. The silence confirmed what I had already realized. They were perfectly content without me. A week after the wedding, my sister posted a lengthy social media tribute to everyone who had made her day special. She thanked the venue coordinator, the photographers, the florists, the caterers, and dozens of friends and family members who had supported her. She thanked my parents for their love and guidance, her new husband for his patience during the planning process, even her college roommate who had helped address invitations. My name appeared nowhere in the post. Months of work, thousands of dollars of my own money, countless hours of coordination and planning, and I had been completely erased from the narrative of her perfect day. I was mentioned only in the comments, where a distant relative asked about the missing decorative elements, and someone else replied that there had been some coordination issues that were handled beautifully by the professionals. That night, I made my final decision. I would disappear, but I would do it right. Carefully, legally, completely. If they wanted me gone, I would give them the gift of never having to deal with my inadequacy again. The week after my sister's wedding, I began the methodical process of dismantling my life. I had always been organized, but now I channeled that skill towards something that actually mattered to me, creating a future where I controlled the terms of my own existence. First, I met with a lawyer to understand my legal options. The consultation cost me $200 I could barely spare, but it was the best investment I had ever made. She explained how to protect assets during family disputes, how to establish financial independence, and most importantly, how to create legal barriers that would prevent family members from accessing my accounts or making claims on my property. "Are you in danger?" she asked, reviewing the list of precautions I wanted to take. "Not physically," I said, "but I need to protect myself from people who will try to manipulate me into coming back to a situation that's harmful to my mental health." She nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen similar cases. Within 3 days, I had new bank accounts at an institution my family had never used, a safe deposit box for important documents, and legal documentation establishing my financial independence. Next, I put my condo on the market. I had purchased it 3 years earlier with help from my savings and a small gift from my grandparents, money that my parents had encouraged me to use for something practical. The real estate market was favorable, and the location was desirable. My realtor projected a quick sale that would leave me with enough profit to start over anywhere I chose. Leaving my job was more difficult emotionally. My boss had noticed my distraction during the wedding planning months, but she had also witnessed my dedication over the previous 4 years. When I requested a meeting to discuss my resignation, she seemed genuinely concerned. "Is this about the family situation you mentioned?" she asked. "Because if you need extended leave or a flexible schedule, we can work something out. You're too valuable to lose over temporary stress." For a moment, I considered telling her the truth, that I was planning to disappear from my family's life entirely and start over somewhere else entirely. But the fewer people who knew my plans, the better my chances of executing them successfully. "I've decided to pursue opportunities in a different market," I said instead. "I need a complete change of environment to grow professionally." She accepted my resignation with disappointment, but also provided an excellent reference letter and the promise of a positive recommendation for future opportunities. Before leaving, I quietly copied all my portfolio materials and client testimonials to personal files, building the foundation of credentials I would need to freelance remotely. The most challenging part was handling shared financial obligations without alerting my family to my plans. My parents and I had joint accounts from my college years that I had never bothered to separate, accounts they occasionally used for family expenses or emergencies. Closing these accounts required careful timing to avoid triggering questions. I waited until my father was traveling for work and my mother was focused on post-wedding thank you notes. Then I withdrew my contributions to the shared accounts, leaving only their original deposits, and closed my access to the joint credit cards. I transferred the funds to my new private accounts and documented everything in case there were questions later about financial propriety. My sister's honeymoon provided the perfect cover for the final phase of preparation. With her out of the country and my parents busy with their normal routines, I had 2 weeks to complete the most visible changes without immediate detection. I sold my furniture to an estate sale company, keeping only what would fit in my car and a small storage unit. I canceled utilities, transferred my mail to a postal forwarding service, and notified my landlord that I would be vacating early, forfeiting my security deposit to avoid the standard notice requirements. The hardest part was dealing with personal belongings that connected me to family memories, photo albums, gifts from relatives, mementos from family vacations, items that had no monetary value but represented decades of shared experiences. I spent an entire evening going through boxes of keepsakes, deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to simply throw away. In the end, I kept very little. A few photographs of my grandparents, some books that had shaped my thinking, and a small jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother before she died. Everything else felt contaminated by the recent betrayal, transformed from treasured memories into reminders of relationships that had never been what I thought they were. By the time my sister returned from her honeymoon, I had created a completely new life infrastructure. New bank accounts, new job prospects, new housing arrangements, even a new phone number that would make it difficult for them to contact me impulsively. The condo sold faster than expected, closing just 10 days after the honeymoon ended. I used the proceeds to pay off my remaining debts, reimburse myself for wedding expenses, and create an emergency fund that would support me for months in a new city. On my last day in the apartment, I stood in the empty living room where I had spent so many evenings planning family events, coordinating care for my mother, and dreaming of a future where my efforts would finally be appreciated. The silence felt different now. Not lonely, but peaceful. I was ready to find out who I could become when I wasn't trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth it. The coastal town I chose was nothing like anywhere I had lived before. 3 hours north of San Francisco, it was small enough to disappear in, but large enough to support the kind of remote freelance work I was planning to pursue. I had never been there before selecting it from online research. which felt appropriate for this new version of my life. I rented a small cottage 6 blocks from the ocean, furnished it with the basics from local secondhand shops, and set up a home office that looked nothing like the corporate environment I had left behind. The walls were painted a soft blue that reminded me of the water I could see from my kitchen window, and I decorated with plants and artwork from local artisans, rather than the generic professional decor I had accumulated over the years. For the first month, I lived under a kind of self-imposed witness protection program. I used my legal name for official documents, but introduced myself to neighbors and local business owners as Annie, close enough to my real name that I would respond naturally, different enough that casual internet searches by family members wouldn't immediately locate me. The transition to freelance work was surprisingly smooth. My former boss had been true to her word about providing references, and my portfolio of marketing projects attracted clients within my first few weeks of active networking. I specialized in helping small businesses develop their online presence, work that could be done entirely remotely, and paid well enough to support my deliberately simplified lifestyle. For the first time in my adult life, I had no family obligations competing for my attention, no medical appointments to coordinate, no family gatherings to organize, no crisis management calls that interrupted my professional focus. I discovered that I was actually quite good at my work when I could devote my full energy to it. The local community was welcoming in the way that small towns often are to newcomers who contribute positively to the local economy. I joined a book club at the library, started volunteering at the animal shelter on weekends, and became a regular at the farmers market on Saturday mornings. These relationships developed organically, based on shared interests, rather than family obligation or workplace proximity. 3 months into my new life, I realized I hadn't checked social media in weeks. I had initially used it to monitor my family's activities from a distance, but gradually lost interest in tracking their lives. The wedding photos that had once felt like evidence of my erasure now seemed like pictures of strangers at an event I had helped organize but never really belonged to. The physical changes were subtle but significant. I slept better, woke up more easily, and found myself smiling spontaneously during routine activities like grocery shopping or walking on the beach. Food tasted better when I wasn't eating it while stressed about family dynamics. Colors seemed brighter when I wasn't viewing everything through the lens of anxiety about disappointing someone. I started taking photographs again, something I had enjoyed in college but abandoned when family responsibilities consumed my free time. The coastal landscape provided endless subjects, and I began building a portfolio of nature photography that attracted interest from local galleries and tourism businesses. 6 months after leaving, I received an email from my former employer asking if I would consider taking on a major project as a consultant. The work would pay 3 times what I had earned as a full-time employee, and I could complete it entirely from my home office. I accepted the project and completed it ahead of schedule, earning both a substantial payment and a reputation that led to additional high-value consulting opportunities. By the 1-year anniversary of my departure, I owned my cottage outright, had built a successful freelance business, and maintained a savings account larger than any I had achieved while supporting family obligations. More importantly, I had learned to make decisions based on what I wanted rather than what others expected from me. I was no longer Amy the caretaker, Amy the reliable one, Amy the disappointment. I was simply Amy, learning who that person could be when given the freedom to discover her own potential. The discovery happened 14 months after I had disappeared from their lives. I learned about it the way I learned about most things related to my former family, through social media posts that friends of friends shared, creating ripples that eventually reached even my carefully constructed new existence. My cousin posted a frantic message on her timeline. "Has anyone heard from Amy? Her parents are really worried and trying to reach her. Please share if you have any information about where she might be." The post was accompanied by a photo of me from my sister's wedding. Ironically, one of the few pictures from that day where I was visible, looking tired and stressed in the background while my family celebrated. Within hours, the post had dozens of shares and comments from relatives and family friends expressing concern and offering to help with the search. I sat in my cottage, surrounded by the peaceful life I had built, and watched my family orchestrate a public campaign to locate me. The narrative they had constructed was masterful in its manipulation. I was portrayed as unstable, possibly suffering from a mental health crisis that had caused me to abandon my family without explanation. My mother gave an interview to the local newspaper back home, describing me as troubled and claiming that I had taken money from family accounts before disappearing. The article mentioned my sister's wedding as the last time anyone had seen me, but described the circumstances vaguely, making it sound like I had simply vanished without provocation. "We're worried she might hurt herself," my father told a local television reporter. "She was always fragile, and we think the stress of recent family events might have triggered some kind of breakdown. The irony was breathtaking. The same people who had told me my absence would be the best gift I could give them were now claiming to be devastated by my disappearance. The family that had treated me as optional for decades was suddenly portraying my presence as essential to their happiness. But the most sophisticated part of their campaign was how they positioned themselves as victims of my selfishness. Social media posts described how my abandonment had affected my mother's health, how my father was beside himself with worry, how my sister felt guilty that our argument at her wedding had somehow triggered my disappearance. They hired a private investigator who traced my movements as far as the sale of my condo, but couldn't follow the trail beyond that point. The legal precautions I had taken made it impossible for them to access my financial records or discover my new location through official channels. When private investigation failed, they escalated to public manipulation. A Facebook page called Find Amy appeared, complete with photos from family gatherings and childhood events that painted a picture of a beloved daughter who had mysteriously vanished. The page accumulated hundreds of followers, many of whom shared increasingly elaborate theories about what might have happened to me. My sister posted a tearful video message explaining how much she missed me and how sorry she was about our misunderstanding at her wedding. She never mentioned what the misunderstanding was about, making it sound like a minor disagreement rather than a fundamental rejection of my worth as a family member. "I just want my sister back," she said, looking directly into the camera with the kind of earnest vulnerability that had always made people want to help her. "Whatever happened between us, we can work it out. Family is more important than any argument." The comments on her video were heartbreaking to read. Hundreds of people expressing sympathy for her loss, sharing their own stories of family conflicts, offering prayers and support for her efforts to reconnect with me. They had successfully transformed the narrative from family rejects daughter to daughter abandons loving family. 3 months into their campaign, they claimed to have received information suggesting I might be in danger. This prompted them to file a missing person report, despite the fact that I was an adult who had left voluntarily and committed no crimes. The police investigation was cursory. They quickly determined that I had left of my own accord and was not in any legal trouble, but it provided my family with additional legitimacy for their public search efforts. The most manipulative tactic came near the end: claims of medical emergencies that required my immediate return. My father supposedly had chest pains that doctors couldn't diagnose. My mother's diabetes had supposedly worsened dramatically. These emergencies were always vague enough to be unprovable, but urgent enough to justify renewed search efforts. I watched all of this unfold from my peaceful cottage, feeling like an anthropologist studying the behavior of a species I had once belonged to. Their campaign revealed everything I had always known but never wanted to acknowledge. They were perfectly capable of caring about me when it served their purposes, but utterly incapable of examining their own behavior or taking responsibility for the pain they had caused. The most telling detail was what they never did. They never apologized. Through months of public pleading and private investigation, they never once acknowledged that their treatment of me might have been wrong. 2 years after I disappeared, their campaign finally reached me directly. A private investigator had traced my digital footprints carefully enough to identify my new location, though not my exact address. I returned home one evening to find a letter slipped under my door. No return address, but I recognized my mother's handwriting immediately. "We know you're in California," the letter began. "We know you're safe and working. We just want to talk." The letter was 3 pages of carefully crafted emotional manipulation, references to childhood memories, mentions of family health scares, promises that everything could go back to normal if I would just come home for a visit. It ended with my mother's phone number and a request to call within 1 week, or they would have no choice but to take more direct action. I sat on my porch, watching the sunset over the ocean, and realized this moment had always been inevitable. They would never stop trying to pull me back into their orbit because my absence forced them to confront something they couldn't accept: that their treatment of me had been wrong enough to drive me away permanently. But I had spent 2 years building a life based on my own choices and values. I had learned what it felt like to be appreciated for my contributions, to form relationships based on mutual respect, to wake up each morning without dreading the next family crisis or obligation. The person who had desperately sought their approval no longer existed. I wrote my response carefully, editing it multiple times to remove any trace of anger or bitterness. I wanted them to understand my decision, not to hurt them in return for the pain they had caused me. "I am safe, healthy, and happy," I wrote. "I have built a successful career and meaningful relationships in my new community. I left because being part of our family was detrimental to my mental health and self-worth, and nothing has changed to make me believe returning would be different. I detailed specific incidents, not just the wedding disaster, but years of comparisons, dismissals, and the fundamental message that my needs were less important than everyone else's comfort. I explained how their recent campaign to find me had only confirmed my decision by demonstrating that they still viewed me as property to be retrieved, rather than a person whose choices deserved respect. If you genuinely want what's best for me, I concluded, you will respect my decision to remain where I am. I wish you all well, but I will not be returning to a situation that required me to diminish myself in order to maintain family harmony. I sent the letter and changed my phone number the same day. I also contacted a local attorney to document the correspondence in case their more direct action involved any form of harassment or legal pressure. Their response was predictably manipulative. Social media posts claiming I had been brainwashed by unspecified influences. Renewed efforts to portray themselves as victims of my cruelty. Attempts to contact my clients and local businesses in my new town, spreading concerns about my mental state and reliability. But these efforts backfired. The people who knew me in my new life had witnessed my competence, stability, and positive contributions to the community. When strangers called with vague warnings about my character, my friends and colleagues rallied to defend me. The local business network that had embraced me proved stronger than my family's distant manipulation attempts. After 6 months of unsuccessful pressure tactics, their campaign finally quieted. The social media posts became less frequent, then stopped entirely. The private investigator bills apparently became too expensive to justify. The reality settled in that I was not coming back, no matter what strategies they employed. 3 years after my disappearance, I learned through mutual acquaintances that my parents had begun telling people I had died in an accident. It was easier for them to be victims of tragedy than to be held accountable for driving away their own daughter. My sister, now divorced and struggling with her own career setbacks, apparently encouraged this fiction because it was simpler than explaining our family dynamics to new friends. I felt surprisingly little sadness about being declared dead by the people who had given me life. It seemed like an appropriate metaphor. The Amy who had desperately sought their approval was indeed dead. In her place was a woman who had learned to value herself, who had built meaningful relationships based on mutual respect, who woke up each morning grateful for the life she had created, rather than resentful about the life she had been assigned. I never married, but I never felt lonely. I built a successful consulting business that allowed me to travel and work with clients around the world. I maintained close friendships with people who appreciated my humor, intelligence, and loyalty. I volunteered for causes I believed in, and spent my free time pursuing interests I had never had time for when I was managing everyone else's needs. Most importantly, I learned that family is something you create, not something you're born into. The people who truly knew me, my chosen family of friends, colleagues, and community members, would never have suggested that my absence was the best gift I could give them. They valued my presence, celebrated my successes, and supported me through challenges without expecting me to earn their love through constant sacrifice. My parents live in the same house where I grew up, probably still wondering what they did wrong. Never understanding that the problem wasn't any single action, but decades of making me feel like I was never quite enough. My sister continues her life, probably telling new friends that she's an only child, finding it easier than explaining why her sister chose to disappear. As for me, I am exactly where I chose to be. Some people might say I was too harsh, that family should forgive and forget, that I threw away relationships over pride. But I know the difference between pride and self-preservation, between forgiveness and self-destruction. I chose myself. For the first time in my life, I chose myself. And that choice gave me everything I had been searching for in all the wrong places.